They say the wind still carries her final scream across the valley, thin, trembling, almost swallowed by the mountains that once protected her people. It slips through the pines at dusk, brushing against the abandoned stones of a vanished village, and for a moment, it feels as if time itself pauses to listen. No records survive of her true name. No portrait, no inscription, no relic carved in her likeness. Only a story whispered across generations. A chieftain's daughter, fated not by crime or treachery, but by a prophecy born of fear. She was offered to the gods to stop a war the elders believed was rushing toward them like a storm. A war that, as later generations realized with a shudder, would never have come at all. Tonight, we exhume her tale, not as a myth, not as a moral lesson, but as a tragedy carved into the memory of a forgotten people. If you wish to support the preservation of stories like hers, stories buried beneath centuries of silence, consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and joining our growing community of dark history explorers. Your support ensures these lost voices are heard again. They called it the Valley of Shadows long before her birth, long before any living elder could remember why. Some blamed the name on the towering cliffs that swallowed half the sunlight each afternoon, plunging the settlement into early dusk. Others whispered that it came from something older than the tribe itself, a presence that moved among the pine trees at night, leaving the branches trembling as if touched by invisible hands. But whatever the origin, the name clung to the valley like morning frost, shaping every ritual, every fear, and every whispered superstition. And into this half-lit world, she was born. The night of her birth had been an unsettling one. The moon, usually serene, appeared shrouded in crimson haze, a strange atmospheric veil that turned the river dark as wine. Women who tended the laboring mother exchanged uneasy glances, their hands moving quickly as they fed the fire herbs that released sharp, bitter smoke. The chieftain himself waited outside the birthing hut, pacing in tight circles, fingers twitching around the hilt of the ceremonial knife he always wore at his belt. When the baby finally cried, thin, piercing, almost startled, the sound made the wolves in the hillside answer with their own howls. The tribe's spiritual leader, an old woman whose face was carved with so many wrinkles her eyes seemed lost within them, entered the hut moments later. She studied the newborn carefully, turning the child gently until she saw the mark. A faint red streak across the girl's left shoulder, no wider than a fingertip, but bright enough to seem painted on by some unseen hand. The elder stepped back. The room fell silent. This was the sign they had feared, the sign the prophecy had spoken of generations ago. A child born under a blood-hazed moon, marked on the shoulder, destined to be the offering that would prevent a war foretold by their ancestors. When the elder announced her verdict to the village, frost seemed to creep across the valley floor, though it was midsummer. Some wept openly. Others nodded with grim acceptance. The chieftain said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had the weight of someone already mourning a child, not yet an hour old. "She is mine," he said, "but she belongs to the prophecy more." Yet despite the curse whispered at her cradle, the girl grew, not as a feared omen, but as a quiet, inquisitive child whose laughter chipped away at the dread surrounding her. She ran through the tall grasses like a doe, climbed the pine ridges with the agility of someone born of the mountains, and spent long afternoons sitting beside the river, tracing spirals in the water with her fingertips. Those who feared her in private could not deny her gentleness. The chieftain loved her with a fierceness that startled even him. He had lost a wife years earlier, and in the girl he found both memory and hope, even as her presence reminded him of the fate he could not escape. The villagers watched her grow, with conflicted hearts. Mothers sent their sons and daughters to play with her, but always kept them within calling distance. Warriors bowed their heads respectfully when she passed, though they never met her gaze directly. Even the spiritual leader, who had declared her future on the night of her birth, seemed to struggle each year she saw the child become more human and less symbol. Only the girl herself seemed unaware of the quiet storm of expectation that followed her like a second shadow. By the time she reached her 13th winter, unease had returned to the valley. Hunters reported finding abandoned campsites in the woods, though no footsteps led away from them. Smoke was seen rising from far-off ridges that did not belong to their tribe. A trader returning from the plains claimed that another chieftain to the east was gathering warriors, sharpening spears, preparing for something dark on the horizon. Fear settled over the village like ash, and with fear came the resurgence of the prophecy. Rumors twisted into certainty. The elders insisted the signs aligned too perfectly to ignore. They spoke of ancient battles, of enemies driven by greed, of spirits who demanded balance through blood. Every discussion circled back to her. The child born beneath the cursed moon, the marked one, the promised offering. She felt the shift long before anyone told her the truth. Husbands whispered to wives when they thought she could not hear. Warriors lowered their voices when she approached. Even her father grew quieter, his smile trembling at the edges like a candle flame threatened by wind. She sensed something slipping away from the life she knew, like the valley itself was holding its breath. One evening, as she sat by the river watching the sky darken into bands of violet and indigo, she asked her father why everyone seemed so afraid. He could not lie to her, but he could not tell her everything either. So he answered the only way a grieving man could. Because, he said, lifting her chin so she met his eyes, some destinies follow us whether we run from them or not. The river carried her reflection downstream, rippling, fragile, and fleeting. For the first time in her young life, she wondered if she had ever truly belonged to herself at all. The night chosen for the ceremony arrived without warning, as if the elders feared giving the village enough time to question their decision. At dawn they announced it. By nightfall, the offering would be made. The words drifted through the settlement like smoke, curling into doorways, seeping beneath rooftops, settling heavily in the lungs of every man and woman who heard them. Silence followed, the kind of silence that comes only when a community feels the weight of its own guilt pressing down upon it. Her father tried to argue. He pleaded with the elders until his voice cracked, until even the warriors who guarded the council felt compelled to look away. But tradition stood taller than grief, thicker than blood, and the prophecy, carved into the memory of their ancestors, was a blade no one dared challenge. The spiritual leader reminded him that the survival of the tribe demanded sacrifice. The chieftain stood alone against them, surrounded by men who had once followed him without hesitation. For the first time, he realized his authority had become as fragile as thin ice. By late afternoon, preparations had begun. The ceremonial stones were washed with river water, leaving streaks of cold across their surfaces. Torches were set in a wide circle around the sacred platform, their flames licking upward as though impatient for night. Women brought woven cloths dyed in crimson and black, symbols of death and transition. Men carried long strands of smokeweed to burn, believing its sharp scent would guide the girl's spirit toward gentler realms. In the center of the village, she was washed and dressed by women who could not stop their hands from trembling. They whispered prayers through tight throats, their breath warm against her hair, their tears falling silently onto her skin. She stood still, her eyes distant, as if already walking somewhere they could not follow. No one had told her the full truth, but she had always been uncomfortably perceptive. From the moment the sun rose, she knew the world she woke in would not be the one she left when night fell. When her father entered the hut, the women parted like reeds in a river, leaving him alone with his daughter. For a moment he could not move. She looked so small in the ceremonial garments, so unbearably young. He took her hands, noticing how cold they were. She stared up at him with a question in her eyes, but she did not speak. Words felt too fragile for what lay between them. "I will walk with you," he said finally. She nodded, even though they both knew he would not be allowed to follow her all the way. As dusk settled, the village gathered under the weight of their ancestors' expectations. The torches cast wavering halos of gold around the sacred platform, but the air felt colder than the deepest winter. Smokeweed burned in small clay bowls, releasing a bitter scent that stung the eyes. The spiritual leader stood at the platform's edge, her face painted in ash, her expression carved from stone. The crowd parted as the girl and her father approached. No one dared meet the chieftain's eyes. Some pressed their hands to their hearts. Others stared at the ground, ashamed of their silence, yet too afraid to break tradition. When they reached the steps of the platform, her father hesitated. He held her hands tighter, desperate to memorize the shape of them. "You do not walk alone," he whispered, voice trembling. "Remember that." She looked at him with a calmness far beyond her years. "I know." The spiritual leader cleared her throat softly. The signal. He let go. She ascended the steps barefoot, the cold stone biting into her feet. The chants began slowly, a deep, rhythmic murmur rising from the crowd. It vibrated through the air, thrumming in her bones like the pulse of the earth itself. She stood in the center of the platform as the elder approached, carrying the sacred blade, a slender knife forged long ago for rituals no one dared abandon. The elder lifted the blade toward the sky. The chanting grew louder. The smoke thickened. The girl closed her eyes. For a moment, everything stilled. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then a single scream tore through the night, not from the girl, but from her father, who collapsed to his knees at the edge of the circle, begging, pleading, sobbing like a man whose soul had been torn from him. Warriors held him back as he fought to reach her, but his cries were swallowed by the roar of the chants and the crackle of torches. The blade descended. The valley exhaled, and in the hollow that followed, something ancient and cruel settled into the hearts of all who witnessed it. A truth none dared speak aloud. What had been done could never be undone. Dawn broke slowly over the valley, as if even the sun hesitated to return to a place where so much had been lost only hours before. A pale, hesitant light spilled across the mountains, touching the tops of the pines before rolling down into the settlement below. Normally, morning brought a kind of quiet renewal. Smoke rising from hearths, roosters calling, children laughing as they ran between huts. But this morning, the valley felt hollow, as though some unseen hand had carved out its heart. The air was still. The birds did not sing. Even the river seemed to move more quietly, as if mourning with the people who lived beside it. The villagers avoided the sacred platform, leaving it untouched, unspoken of, as if approaching it might reopen a wound too deep to bear. The girl's blood had dried on the stones overnight, darkening into a rusty stain that glinted faintly beneath the rising sun. No one dared wash it away. Some believed the gods needed time to absorb the offering. Others feared that scrubbing the stone would anger whatever spirit had demanded her life. Her father had not slept. He had spent the night on the ground outside the ceremonial circle, rocking back and forth like a man adrift in a storm. His hair, once kept meticulously braided as a symbol of leadership, hung loose and tangled across his face. When the elders approached him at sunrise, he did not stand. He did not speak. He stared past them toward the horizon, his eyes unfocused, as if searching for the enemy whose imagined arrival had cost him everything. By midday, scouts were sent to the ridgelines to look for signs of approaching warriors. Smoke, tracks, the echo of marching, anything. They returned with nothing. The elders insisted that patience was necessary, that omens did not lie, and enemies could hide their movements. The tribe held its breath and waited. Hours passed, then a day, then two. Still nothing. The silence, once a gentle companion of the valley, became suffocating. Every creak of a branch, every distant rustle of leaves made villagers flinch, expecting an army to emerge from the tree line. But no shadows moved except those cast by the wind. No war drums sounded in the distance. The horizon remained painfully empty. Whispers began to slip between huts like cold drafts. What if the prophecy had been misinterpreted? What if fear, not fate, had guided their actions? Mothers clutched their children closer. Warriors sharpened their spears until the blades were thin from overgrinding. The elders spoke less often, retreating into their hut for long secretive discussions. And threading through it all was a question no one dared ask aloud. Had they killed her for nothing? Her father asked it for them. On the third night, he entered the council hut uninvited. The warriors at the door did not try to stop him. Something about the way he moved, slow, deliberate, empty, made them step aside without a word. The elders rose to greet him, but he did not acknowledge them. He stood in the center of the room, the fire casting a flickering orange glow across his hollowed features. You said the war was coming, he whispered, though the silence carried his voice with unnatural clarity. You said her death would save us. The elder matriarch tried to answer, but he cut her off with a tremor of his hand. Where is this enemy? Show me the tracks. Show me the smoke of their campfires. Show me a single blade raised against us. No one spoke. The fire crackled softly. If she died for a lie, he continued, his voice breaking, then you have murdered the valley itself. His words fell like stones into water, sending ripples through the council that would never fully fade. No elder dared reply. In their silence, he found his answer. He left without another word. In the days that followed, cracks began to form in the tribe's foundation. Families argued quietly inside their homes. Young men questioned the authority of the elders for the first time in their lives. The spiritual leader withdrew from public ritual, spending her hours alone by the riverbank, staring into the water as if searching for absolution. The prophecy that had once united the tribe now gnawed at it like a slow, rotting sickness. And then came the final confirmation of their mistake. A wandering trader, ragged, dust-covered, oblivious to the tension waiting for him, arrived from the east. He brought simple goods, bone charms, dried fruit, flintstones. But it was his news that shattered the fragile remnants of the tribe's belief. The eastern chieftain, the supposed enemy gathering forces, had suffered a harsh winter. His people were starving. He had no army, no provisions for war, no intention to leave his territory. The valley froze. For a long moment, no one breathed. The truth, heavy, merciless, fell upon them all. There had never been a war. There had never been a threat. The chieftain's daughter had been sacrificed to stop a shadow that did not exist. And in the awful stillness that followed, the valley finally understood the enormity of what it had done. The years that followed her death unfolded like pages in a book left out in the rain. Ink bleeding, stories blurring, memories dissolving into one another. At first, the valley tried to continue as it always had. Fires were lit at dawn, children were taught to track deer through the pines, and the elders resumed their rituals with voices that shook more than they once had. But the fabric of the tribe had been torn, and no amount of routine could mend the rip that ran straight through its heart. The valley itself seemed changed. The wind moved differently, carrying with it a faint, sorrowful hum. Some said it was just the shifting of the seasons. Others whispered it was her spirit. Her father became a shadow of the man he once was. He no longer addressed the council, no longer braided his hair in the traditional patterns of leadership. Instead, he spent long hours walking the ridge, overlooking the sacred platform, tracing the same narrow path until the grass beneath his boots vanished completely. Villagers saw him there at dusk, motionless as stone, gazing down at the place where his daughter's life had ended. Some pitied him, others avoided him, afraid that grief of such magnitude might be contagious. But no one interrupted him. Grief, they understood too late, was a kind of authority more powerful than any title. As seasons passed, the tribe dwindled, not through war or famine, but through quiet abandonment. Young families left first, seeking valleys untouched by prophecy. Hunters returned from expeditions and announced they would not spend another winter in a place haunted by regret. Even some elders slipped away in the night, carrying only their blankets and the unbearable knowledge that they had led their people into ruin. The spiritual leader, once the voice of unwavering tradition, spent her last months living by the river where she had once gone to pray. She carved a small wooden figure each day, tiny, fragile effigies of the girl she had condemned. When she died, the river carried the figures away one by one. In time, the settlement shrank until only a handful of families remained, clinging to familiar soil even as their world unraveled. The valley, once alive with the clatter of wooden wheels and children's laughter, grew eerily quiet. Smoke rose from fewer and fewer hearths. The ceremonial platform, once the center of their spiritual life, stood untouched, overgrown with moss that crept slowly across its stones like nature's attempt to cover a wound. Eventually, the valley was abandoned entirely. No migration was organized. No farewell ritual was performed. People simply left, each believing they were one the last. Huts collapsed over the decades that followed, their roofs caving inward, their walls surrendering to creeping vines and the patient insistence of rot. The stone circles cracked. The pathways disappeared beneath a blanket of fallen needles. Nature reclaimed what had once been taken from it, though some argued the land never truly forgave. Yet the valley did not empty completely. Travelers began to speak of strange encounters. Whispers carried on cold currents of air, flickers of movement glimpsed between the pines, faint traces of footprints where none should exist. One hunter claimed he heard a girl crying near the riverbank at dawn, her voice thin as frost. A wandering priest swore that while passing through the ruins, he felt the weight of unseen eyes watching him. A merchant from the plains told of seeing a young girl standing on the ceremonial platform at twilight, motionless, her hair drifting as if stirred by a wind that touched only her. Most dismissed these tales as superstition, but the stories persisted, pooling across regions, merging into a legend too haunting to ignore. They said she lingered because she had not been allowed to finish her life, because her death had no purpose, because promises made to the gods have been built on sand, and souls bound to false prophecy cannot rest. They called her the ghost of the Valley of Shadows, a spirit who walked the ridges at dusk searching for the childhood stolen from her, for the father who could not save her, for the answer to a question she died without understanding. Over centuries, the story evolved. Some cultures told it as a warning against the dangers of blind obedience, others as a tale of parental grief powerful enough to echo through time. Poets softened her fate into metaphor, turning her into a symbol of innocence devoured by fear. Priests reshaped her into a martyr who died for the sins of those too frightened to think for themselves. But beneath all the retellings, beneath the embellishments and distortions and ceremonial reinterpretations, the core of the story remained unmistakably human. A girl lived, a girl died, and her people perished because they feared a future that never came. Modern historians, those few who venture into forgotten corners of the world, still argue about the valley. Excavations have uncovered fragments of pottery, the remains of hearthstones, and the shallow outline of the ceremonial platform beneath centuries of moss. But no written record remains. Only the legend passed from one generation to another, like a fragile ember carried across the ages. Yet those who stand in the valley at dusk, when the sun slips behind the cliffs and shadows stretch long across the earth, claim the place still holds its breath, waiting, listening, remembering. And if the wind is right, they say you can hear it, a soft cry, almost too faint to notice, rising and falling with the evening breeze. A voice that should have lived far longer, a life that should never have been taken, a sacrifice made to stop a war that never began. As the sun sinks behind the cliffs and shadows swallow the valley once more, remember her story, the girl stolen by prophecy, the life lost to fear, and the echoes that still wander through time. Some say her spirit waits for those who dare to listen, for those who remember the cost of blind obedience. Now I want to hear from you. If you could ask the chieftain's daughter one question, one thing you wish you could tell her, what would it be? Share it in the comments below. I'll be reading them, and together, we'll give her voice back, even if only for a moment. If her story left you unsettled, haunted, or in awe, make sure to like this video, so that more forgotten voices can rise from the shadows. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell, because the next dark tale waits just beyond the horizon, ready to pull you into the past, where history is never as simple as it seems.